Let's talk a little bit about choosing an appropriate method for conducting our research and some of the practicalities involved in developing research. So, for this short talk, we will concentrate on the objectives highlighted in bold. So not just about looking at research methods and methodology, but also avoiding bias and thinking about some of the practical steps in conducting your research. I think first we need to start by thinking about which study design we're going to use, and really the question is what you're trying to do. And there is a hierarchy of different things we might be trying to achieve and different research methods that would match with these. So if you're measuring the effectiveness of an intervention, the gold standard is a prospective randomized controlled trial. If it's a diagnostic test, we may be doing diagnostic studies. If we're comparing populations or different types of exposure to risk factors for disease, then we maybe use case control studies or cohort studies. If we just want to describe a phenomenon or a population, then we think about surveillance studies. And if we're describing people's attitudes or trying to elicit people's responses to certain questions or topics, then we may use a survey. And finally, if we want a little deeper insight into the underlying reasons for something that we've observed, we may think about qualitative methods. Just to bear in mind, sometimes we combine some of these methods into one study. So mixed method studies combining quantitative methods such as randomized controlled trial or case control study with qualitative methods such as semi-structured interviews is quite a common way of doing research as well. So we said the prospective randomized control trial is the gold standard for research, but we need to talk a little bit about the practicalities of this, because what you'll find is that you are very unlikely to be doing a prospective randomized control trial in your setting. Even though you're not going to do it, if you are looking at an intervention or comparing two interventions, there are certain elements of the randomized controlled trial design that you might want to retain. It's always better to collect data prospectively, looking back on data that maybe is stored in a database or is written into the patient notes is notoriously unreliable. We don't know what people have recorded or why they've recorded it, for example, and often critical data is missing because people just didn't bother to record it. We may not be able to truly randomize patients to an intervention or a control arm of a study. However, we can consider quasi-randomization, such as randomizing days of the week in which we're going to collect data, or randomizing sites on which we're going to collect data. It's always good if you're doing any kind of intervention or study to have a comparator group, so you know you're testing this intervention, but no matter how much data you collect on that intervention, it doesn't tell you about its effectiveness unless you can compare it with some other group that did not have the intervention. So it's always good to have a control. And the trial part of it speaks for itself. So there's a little difference between methodology and methods. The research methodology refers to the overarching approach to your research, so the kind of philosophical basis for how you're going to conduct your research, whereas the methods more refers to the practical details required to carry out the research. When you are writing up your method section, it's good to start with an overall statement about the methodology and what you're trying to achieve. So we've given you an example below here about asthma that you can pause and read. So at this point, what I'd like you to do is think about your research question from the first lecture and your rationale and background from the second lecture, and then think about what is the best methodology for your study given what you're trying to investigate. you may want to pause the video here and have a proper think about this and write it down. So when you're conducting your research, there are some important things to consider. You might want to just pause the video here and think about anything practical you might think is important to consider, and then we'll talk about it. So you have to get ethical approval, and I put that at the top because although we're going to talk about it last, it's one of the things we forget to do. Think carefully about who your study population is, where you're going to draw these study subjects from, and how you define them, both inclusion and exclusion criteria. How are you going to actually recruit them? How are you going to approach these people? How are you going to identify them? And how are you going to tell them about your study, for example? Once you've recruited your subjects, what is the process of collecting data from them? Is some of this data going to be already there for you to look at, like a database or an admission register? Is some data de novo that you have to actually go and talk to people about it? And in that context, think really hard about the quality of the data you're collecting. Like I said, pre-existing data suffers from the prospect of poor quality, so be careful about using pre-existing data or using pre-existing data alone. And finally, even at an early stage, consider how you're going to analyze the data, because data analysis goes hand in hand with data collection. You need to collect the data in the right way to give you the kind of information that you can easily analyze. So let's look at some of these in more detail. As I said before, you need to clearly define your study population, thinking about inclusion criteria. Some of the important parts here are demographics, clinical characteristics, other defining features, the characteristics of your comparators, and also if there are any exclusion criteria. And then consider each of the following: identification, recruitment, informed consent, and giving people the opportunity for a withdrawal. We're going to talk a lot more about consent in our talk on ethics. So we'll just leave that for the time being. What about data collection and quality? Think hard about what you want to collect. It's always important to collect something about patient characteristics in general, so that we can talk about the people that we studied, quite apart from what we were studying. But then you also have data peculiar to this study, maybe symptoms or measurements of things like blood pressure, weight, height, pulse, respiratory rate. Always remember to think about collecting the data and time of the data collection, so you can go back to this if you notice diurnal variation or seasonal variation, for example, and where the data was collected. If you're collecting from more than one site, you need to know what data was collected from each site in case there are variations that are geographically based. We talked a little bit about how to collect the data and the risks of using existing databases, but remember, de novo collection has its own practical problems as well, and many of us will opt for a combined approach, using some existing data and then adding to it by de novo data collection. So pause the video, see if you can tell me what is bias. Well, here is a definition. First thing to say is that quantitative research is supposed to be neutral, objective observation of a phenomenon and objective analysis of the data produced. So it doesn't allow for personal bias or subjectivity. And bias is any factor that systematically impacts on the research process in a way that influences the objectivity or neutrality of the research. And here are some common sources of bias. The Hawthorne effect is just the fact that once somebody knows they're being observed, their behavior changes. And therefore, when you're doing an observational study, you have to be very aware of that. Observational bias is really about the subjectivity of the interpretation of what you are seeing. reporting and recall bias is a real big problem with retrospective data, in that people, when you ask people to think back on what happened, it's very much colored by their subjective view of the matter. Interpretation bias, once we get the data in, if we aren't blinded to who had one intervention as opposed to the other, we tend to interpret the data based on our own subjective influences. And selection bias refers to a bias in selecting people to get into this study. If we're not using a proper randomization process, then we may have a tendency to select people from only one part of the population, for example, younger, healthier people, more cooperative people, people who are more like us. And that then produces a selection bias. Okay, so that was a little talk on both research methodology and some of the practicalities of the research method. If you have any comments, you can post it on the discussion board. And as usual, we have a little task for you from the worksheet. Think about the practicalities of conducting your research, how you're going to collect data, challenges of recruitment, consent. Do you have a backup plan if things go wrong? And what sources of bias do you anticipate, and how can you minimize these?